Today I'm going to be talking about the new cure recently discovered and how this could mean that A, the pandemic is over, B, the financial crisis is cancelled, and C, the housing market is saved. But before we get started, only around 3% of you are actually subscribed to the channel, which is really low. So subscribe. It's free and you can always unsubscribe later if you want. Now let's get into the video. On Monday it was announced that Pfizer have developed a vaccine that's up to 90% effective according to recent trials. As a result, ex-President Trump has implemented a $12 billion programme to provide this vaccine to up to 300 million Americans. In the UK, the PM Boris Johnson has also placed an order for around 40 million doses. Obviously a vaccine would have a massive impact. Now this news has just been recently released and therefore we don't know to what extent of an impact this vaccine will have. Although I was doing a bit of digging and came across this article which suggests that a successful vaccine should at least reduce the risk of the disease by around 50%. If this vaccine does reduce the risk of the disease by 90%, well that's great. The article also suggests that at least 25 to 50% of the population would have to take the vaccine and become immune to the virus to reduce the transmission through herd immunity. Now a vaccine might not necessarily impact the transmission of the pandemic and reduce the spreadability, it might just impact and reduce the negative side effects. But obviously because this information has just been announced, we don't really know how it's going to impact the transmission or the negative side effects, we just know that it's going to reduce the risk by 90%. We also don't really know when this cure or this vaccine is going to be distributed, and we also don't really know when other countries and third world countries are going to get it as well. There would also need to be a very big uptake in the vaccine to be able to meet that 25 to 50% requirement to reduce the spread. Now if not enough people take the vaccine, well we won't achieve that herd immunity and the virus could potentially mutate and become immune to the vaccine. But how would a vaccine impact the economy? Well I think we can already see glimpses of how it might impact the economy by looking at the stock market. The US Dow, the FTSE 100 and the S&P 500 all flew up after the announcement. But let's rewind a little bit. Why is it that airline stocks have fallen, or that hotel stocks have fallen, or that restaurants or shops that have physical stores, why have their stocks fallen? And it's because all of these places have been closed and haven't really been able to operate during the pandemic and during the lockdowns. Why were these businesses, shops and restaurants closed? Because they were kind of like a hotspot for the pandemic and massively increased the spread. Therefore all of these places were closed and people were encouraged to stay home and try and limit the transmission of the pandemic. But with the introduction of this vaccine and providing that it can be distributed pretty rapidly, providing that the uptake is also pretty rapid, and providing that we can meet the 25 to 50% requirement for herd immunity pretty rapidly, well we can obviously slow the transmission of the pandemic and then all of these businesses will be able to open again and operate at maximum efficiency. Now I guess not all businesses will be able to open again because some have already gone bankrupt as a result of the pandemic and some are going bankrupt or soon to go bankrupt as a result of the pandemic and probably won't be able to open their doors even after the introduction of a vaccine. But if loads and loads of businesses can open again, then those stocks will be back on the rise. If American Airlines and EasyJet can start ferrying passengers overseas again without the need for social distancing, and if the population isn't scared of going on holiday, then these stocks will be back on the rise and the company will be back to generating profits. If restaurants are allowed to open with maximum capacity and without the need for social distancing, and if the population starts eating out regularly again, well, these restaurants will start generating profits and their stocks will be back on the rise. Again, if those physical shops like Sports Direct or Primark or Walmart are allowed to open again and not have to go into another lockdown, well, they can start generating proper sales and proper profits for a full year. But just because all these businesses start generating profits again, why will that necessarily make the stocks go up? Well, obviously when businesses are generating heavy losses, investor confidence falls and therefore they start selling off the stock or obviously just not investing more. But when businesses are generating massive profits, then investors obviously will start investing into the stock so they can get a slice of that action. So therefore I think if a vaccine is introduced and it has a really rapid uptake and quickly reaches that herd immunity and all of these businesses can start opening again at maximum efficiency and maximum capacity, well they'll start generating all these proper profits and the stocks will be back on the rise and the economy will recover fairly quickly. What are a lot of businesses that are currently closed and soon going to open going to need? Well, employees. And therefore a lot of people that are currently on furlough leave or have found themselves unemployed as a result of the pandemic could find themselves employed once again. But what does this mean? Well, if everyone's back in work or a large percentage of people are back in work, Well, they'll be earning a salary and they'll have their own income and therefore won't need to rely on furlough support or stimulus checks anymore. If they have this proper income, then they'll be able to start making their mortgage payments again, or their rent payments, or they'll be able to catch up on all the mortgage payments they couldn't make and took mortgage holidays for in the past. If people can start paying their mortgages, well, their homes won't be foreclosed on and they won't lose their homes, and then thousands and if not millions of homes won't flood onto the market, and therefore the housing market won't crash. The market isn't just going to crash for the fun of it, it's always fueled by supply and demand. If millions and millions of people all over the world lose their jobs and therefore can't pay their mortgage and lose their home, and millions of homes flood onto the market, then there's a massive oversupply. And if this is met with a significant reduction in demand, because well, people have lost their jobs and therefore don't have any money and therefore can't go out and buy homes, then there's a housing market crash because there's all this supply but no demand. But if there's no oversupply of homes onto the market, and if anything there's a reduction in supply because loads and loads of new homes this year aren't going to be completed because house builders all over the world were closed in Q2, and there's no reduction in demand because obviously people get their jobs back and get their incomes back, well, if anything there could be a housing market rise. On top of this, you've got those additional measures that have been put in place like the stamp duty holiday to kind of accelerate the market. This will have a similar impact to what the Eat Out to Help Out scheme had a few months ago, and it will kind of increase demand because people will take this opportunity to go out and buy somewhere new. And because of the mortgage holidays or the mortgage forbearance, the supply onto the market isn't super high. Thousands of people haven't already lost their homes because that government support has already been there. If you're enjoying the video so far, be sure to drop a like down below if you haven't already. Also, after this video, be sure to check out some of my other videos, like this one up here. Okay, so, the world has a vaccine for the pandemic. Thousands of shops will be able to open again, all of these stocks will be back on the rise, millions and millions of people will be employed again, and therefore won't lose their homes, and there won't be a housing market crash. Great. But I think the real problem here is the mounting debt. The government has provided billions and billions of support as a result of the pandemic, twice what was provided in 2008. The Eat Out to Help Out scheme was a great idea, but who's going to repay all of this money that was given to those businesses? It will be regular taxpayers like you and I. Furlough pay was also a great idea, but where did the government get all that money from? Billions and billions of pounds worth of government debt was sold to private institutions like banks, pension funds, overseas investors and more. So who's going to pay back all of that debt that was purchased by these private institutions? Again, it will be taxpayers like you and I. The government will have to raise taxes, VAT, stamp duty, import taxes, literally anything they can to get enough money in to start paying down this debt. But I think what's more worrying is that this giant debt that's being created as a result of the pandemic isn't new debt. It just adds to the mounds and mounds of debt that the UK is currently in and that other countries across the world like the US are also currently in. If you look online and you search for the WGA or the whole of government accounts, you can actually see how the UK government is doing if it were to act like a business. These are basically a set of financial statements that brings together everything that the government own, like the NHS, the fire service, the civil service, the armed forces, the police force and everything else. If we look at the 2018-2019 financial statements, we can see that the UK government generated around £800 billion worth of income from taxes like corporation tax, income tax, VAT, council tax and so much more. Now obviously this is an absolutely crazy number, but if we look a little bit lower, we can see that the government actually incurred around £850 billion worth of expenditure, mostly going on social security, staff costs and purchases. So the UK actually generated a loss of around £50 billion. Now I guess to some extent you wouldn't really want the government profiting from you, but this is why the UK is so far in debt and just continues to get further into debt. Because if you were to think of it like a business, it's not a profit-making business. It makes a loss every single year. If we scroll down to the balance sheet, we can see that there's around 2 trillion of assets. Around 1 trillion of this comes from property. Mostly going to be the hospitals, the fire stations, police stations, schools and other buildings like that. But again, the concerning side, if we look a little bit lower, is the 4.5 trillion of liabilities. Most of this coming from the government debt of 1.4 trillion and unfunded pensions of 1.8 trillion. Now, unfunded pensions of 1.8 trillion is also pretty concerning and just makes the UK's debt problem even worse. Some of you might have already seen my accountant review style videos, and you'll know that if you have liabilities that outweigh your assets, it's never really a good thing. Because even if you sold everything that you own, you still wouldn't be able to pay off all of your liabilities. You'd have some left. And that's exactly the position that the UK is in right now. But as I said earlier, this isn't a new problem. If you go back to the 2014-2015 accounts, you've got the same story. 1.4 trillion of assets and 3.5 trillion of liabilities. If you go all the way back to the 2009-2010 accounts, still the same story. 1.2 trillion of assets and 2.4 trillion of liabilities. Now, truth be told, I don't really know what impact this giant amount of debt has on the UK. If it was a normal company that had liabilities that outweighed its assets and it couldn't pay its liabilities on time, then it goes bankrupt. It gets liquidated, just like all of these companies that have gone bankrupt as a result of the pandemic. But you can't exactly bankrupt a country. You can't exactly move everyone that's currently in the UK to France and put a lock on the doors to the UK and the borders and the ports and say, right, no one's allowed in, that country's bankrupt, we're just going to leave it. That debt is just going to continue to pile up and pile up and pile up. And all of the other countries are in a pretty similar position as well. The US is massively in debt, so is China. And it's because we're all in debt to each other. The UK is in debt to the US might be in debt to Australia might be in debt to Germany, and so much more. There's around 258 trillion of debt in the world. Considering pretty much all of these countries are in debt to each other, they wouldn't ever really call in their loans to pay off another loan. For example, say the UK had given a loan to the US and it needed to call it back so that it could pay off its loan to Australia. Well, it would kind of bankrupt the US, and the US would also have to call in its loan from Australia to be able to pay the loan back to the UK, and it just goes in a giant circle and everyone would end up bankrupt. So no one's going to call it in and no one's ever really going to pay off that debt. Therefore, considering no one's ever really going to call in their debts and no one's ever really going to pay off their debts, it doesn't really exist. It's just like numbers on a page. Technically, at some point, debt does have to be repaid because that's what debt is. It's a loan given to someone else to be repaid in the future. But when's it going to be repaid? It's not as if the world's going to reach a certain level of debt, say like 300 trillion worth of debt, and then say, right guys, let's all bankrupt each other so that we can pay off each other's loans. It's just going to continue increasing forever. There's never really going to be a specific point when everyone sits down and decides, right guys, let's pay off those loans. And therefore, even though pretty much all of the countries are in tons and tons of debt, it doesn't really matter because no one's really going to pay off each other's debt and no one's ever going to call in each other's debt because it just bankrupt every single country. And you obviously can't really bankrupt a country and like liquidate it and move everyone out of that country somewhere else. Everything's just going to carry on going as it is, and that debt's just going to keep on getting bigger and bigger. And really, even though it is debt that has to be repaid at some point, it's never really going to get repaid. As always guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out some of my others. Alternatively, subscribe to the channel and ding the notification bell because that way you'll be alerted when I upload a new video. Cheers!